the summer of 2021, Deborah and I decided to take a week of vacation in the Adirondacks. There was still a lot of COVID around, and so we decided to rent an Airbnb cabin on a lake. The only challenge was that in order to get to the cabin, you had to rent a pontoon boat to land on the tiny island where the cabin was built. But it was a really beautiful cabin and looked like an idyllic place and a week, and so we made the reservation. Now, there were a couple of misadventures along the way. We missed the sign, and I was captaining, I would say. I missed the sign, pointing us toward the deeper current of the lake. And so our boat ended up running aground on a log on a very shallow part of this lake. Thankfully, we were not too far from shore, and there were some very bemused locals who, despite having had a few beers, they were happy to come out and help us get our boat off the log. The next challenge was to find the cabin itself. The owner had given us very precise instructions. She said, when you get into the big part of the lake, give me a call on your cell phone. I'll come out in my boat and I'll take you to the cabin. Except that when we got to the middle of this very big lake, we had no cell phone reception. So once again, we were rescued by some very kind locals who actually knew where the cabin was and pointed us in the direction. And eventually we found this idyllic retreat and settled into our beautiful cabin. So I'm someone who is somewhat obsessive about running. And I run almost every day, and I particularly running on vacation. But there was no place to run on this tiny island. But it turned out we were about a 10-minute boat ride to the public docks in Saranac Lake. And so on our first morning there, our dog and I got onto our pontoon boat to make the trip into town. And we pulled into the dock, tied up very successfully, got off the boat, and we began our run through this very, very quaint town in the Adirondacks. Now, about a mile and a half into my run, my hand brushed up against the pocket of my shorts, and to my horror, I felt that it was completely empty. There was nothing in it, no key to the boat. I checked my other pocket, also empty, nothing there. And I knew and I remembered that I had taken the key with me, and so clearly I had lost it along the way. I felt my heart racing with a combination of self-loathing and panic. So I slowly and carefully retraced all my steps up to that point, eyes glued to the ground, searching for my lost key. I walked into a couple of restaurants and shops that I had passed along the way to see if anyone had turned in my key. No luck. I decided to retrace my steps a second time, my heart continuing to pound. Still no sign of the key. Luckily, I did have my cell phone, and it did have reception. So I realized my only hope was to call the marina where we had rented the boat and hope that they had a spare key that they could bring to me. So I called the marina, and the woman who answered the phone said, "Hold on a minute." After a 5-minute pause, she got back on the line and she said, "Your key was just dropped off here 5 minutes ago. A person said she found it on the side of the road and drove it back to us." Did she leave her name and number, I asked. I have to find her, thank her, and tell her that she saved my life. No, she did not leave her name, from the marina said, but where you are located so I can drive the key to you. Within 45 minutes, the key was back in my hand, and I was on my way back to our Airbnb rental. And I couldn't believe how fortunate I had been. Within a span of 24 hours, 3 complete strangers had unmoored our stuck boat, help us to find our rental house in the middle of a giant lake, and most miraculously, driven a key 30 minutes away from where it was found and returned it to the marina. I felt unbelievable gratitude for the kindness of each of these people, none of whom I would ever know or likely talk to again. And I was thinking of these people recently, last spring, when I was teaching a class to a group of our teens on the mitzvah finding lost objects, the mitzvah of Hashevat Avedah. Our rabbis spent a great deal of time considering this issue. Page after page in the Talmud, in the tractate of Baba Metzia, describes what we must do when we find an object of value that doesn't belong to us. And this was a very, very important topic in ancient Israelite times because lots of people's most valuable property could literally walk away from them. Their cow, their ox, their chickens could easily fly the coop. And according to the rabbis, the onus is on the person who finds a lost object to do everything in their power to return it to the owner. They take the verse from the 22nd chapter of Deuteronomy, which says, when you see your neighbor's ox has gone astray, do not see it as lost. And they interpret that as a proactive measure that you must go out of your way to return what belongs to someone else, which is exactly what this kind woman who found my boat key did when she drove 30 minutes to the marina. But in our tradition, our rabbis say this is not something you do if you just happen to be in a good mood and you feel like it. They tell us that this is a mitzvah, it's an obligation, it's a commandment, and we have an obligation to return it. And I think that for our rabbis, this had a lot more to do with something that was just practical, like returning a lost object, something that's deeply transactional. I think our rabbis understood something a little deeper, that there is a psycho-spiritual issue going on as well. Because they understood that when you lose something, it can make you feel really, really bad. And they even had a name for the experience that you might get to when you had given up hope of ever finding it again. They called that word yeush, which literally means despair. All of us have had that feeling of despair when we fear that something is gone forever. When we've lost a key, or a pet, or a wallet, or a ring. Something that seems to disappear without a trace. And when we give up hope that we're ever going to find it again, we have that sense of yeush. And all of us have felt that, and we know it feels awful. Now, I was able to avoid that despair, that yeush during our vacation in the Adirondacks, because these unknown people understood on some level the importance of helping to return lost objects, or helping a lost couple find where they needed to go. And as we prepare to start a new year together, it has dawned on me that there are many of us who have lost things in the past year, or maybe in the past 2.5 years since the pandemic started. Our sages codified a series of lost objects, but they were pointing to something far more significant than just making sure a lost item got returned to its owner. They were saying that a community of people who are committed to each other's well-being can alleviate and even counteract the potential for despair over what we have lost. Because even though we may not be able to recover everything that has been lost, the loving presence of a community can often return a sense of hope. Let me give you a history lesson about an ancient Jewish institution that you may never have heard about that tried to minimize our potential for that sense of despair. In fact, we Jews might have invented the world's first lost and found to try to help recover lost objects. Each year on Rosh Hashanah, our ancestors would make pilgrimage to the temple in Jerusalem. And they didn't come only to worship. They also came with any object that they might have recovered over the course of the year whose owner they had been unable to locate. This ancient lost and found was actually named an Even HaToen, which literally means a stone of lost objects. And it stood on the grounds of the temple. For our ancestors, going to the temple was something that they did only a few times a year. They would not go back and forth each day like we might go to an office or to a school or to a synagogue. Going to the temple was a rare and precious thing. It was a long journey, one that required time and money and preparation. But it also would provide an opportunity for our ancestors to try to return something they had found, and for someone to find something that they had lost. So that on Rosh Hashanah, you might come to the temple and find something that you had been looking for and hoping for that would be returned. But you'd also discover something more important, that you were part of a community that took its obligation to each other seriously. And so that even if you didn't find your lost object, you were reminded that you were surrounded by a community that was there to bring you hope. And your losses would be sweetened by the desire of the members of your community to help you become whole. In a sense, isn't that the essence of what we are trying to do for one another as we start a new year? To offer each other a sense of hope, a way to diminish the sense of yeush, of despair that many of us may be feeling because of the losses we have experienced. If you are comfortable, let me ask you about closing your eyes for just a minute, to think back over this past year or past couple of years, and to think about what have you lost. Maybe it was an object that was especially precious to you. Maybe it's something the pandemic stole from you. Time with loved ones, a sense of being deeply connected to a community. Maybe you lost a job. Maybe your health deteriorated. Maybe you lost your belief in the institutions of democracy that hold this country together. Maybe you have lost a vision of the world's wholeness that is incomplete. A sense of faith in something may seem much less possible. Maybe you have suffered the greatest loss of all, the death of someone you loved, an absence that you feel each and every day. We all know that some of our losses can never be returned or replaced. But even when we know that we may never retrieve all that we have lost over the past year, we know that the presence of a loving family, of loving friends, and of a loving community that feels obligated to support one another can mitigate our sense of despair, can help us prevent each one of us from falling into that state of yeush. Our rabbis call these days Aseret Yemei Tshuva, the 10 days of turning and returning. And we're here not only to do the personal work of our restoring our relationships with God, we're here to do the collective work of returning to one another, to help each other recover from the losses that we never get back, so that we develop the strength to persevere through them because we have been reminded we are not alone. We come to a new year to be reminded, despite our losses, our obligations to each other can help mitigate our sense of despair. And we can do that by just being here, by showing up for one another. And I'm confident that in the course of this coming year, there are going to be innumerable opportunities for us to do that for each other in person and not just via Zoom here at Beth Shalom. You received on your way in a whole calendar of events that are all about the common theme of building community. I want to highlight just a couple. a Shabbat of reconnection on November 12th, Friday night dinner where we're going to all gather together, and we're going to have hosts who are going to be having each of us at their Shabbat tables, but we're going to be doing it collectively. And 6 intergenerational Friday night dinners throughout the year called the Oneg, brought to us through the generosity of the Friedman Family Foundation. And a new initiative where you can volunteer to be part of a minyan for someone during Shiva, so that they can be sure that they will never not have a minyan when they are mourning a loved one. And there are many, many more that we can be there for each other, and we can show up for each other. And for those who have health concerns, there will still be the way of doing that virtually. So that even though Evan HaToen, the stone of lost objects, no longer exists in Jerusalem, this congregation can still function as a place of restoration, a place to be there and to support each other. But its power can only be made real by each one of us. First, by acknowledging what we have lost, and next, by being there to help each other recover from our losses and avoid the potential for despair. So for 1 minute, take a look around this room and see that this is your community. And for those of you who are watching the live stream, imagine you are sitting in this room along with us as well. Because we are obligated to each other to return what we have found, to support ourselves among the losses that can never be returned, because we know that doing so is the antidote to despair. Yes, we know it has been a long period of isolation and dislocation, a time of fear and uncertainty about what the future may hold. Yet at the start of these 10 days of turning, we return to this day of Rosh Hashanah as we affirm what our tradition has always taught us. Today, the world begins anew, because none of us alone is alone, because each one of us is obligated to one another, and because in community, despair will never have the final verdict. Ken Yehi Ratzon, so may it be. Shana Tova.